Scandals, rivalries, love affairs, and sexual tension. Sound like your favorite soap opera? Well, according to this best-selling author, it's no soap opera at all. It's the world of ESPN, and he takes us behind the scenes there right now on It's Your Call. Hi there, everyone. It's great to have you along. As always, I'm Lynn Doyle, giving you a chance this hour to hear from those folks who were there at the very beginning of ESPN some 32 years ago. We'll also hear from some who joined along the way and from a few who remain there today. Together, they paint a picture of success and controversy. Jim Miller, along with his co-author Tom Shales, interviewed some 500 people about ESPN, and the result is this best-selling book. Those guys have all the fun inside the world of ESPN. It's a book that's not only generating a lot of interest, but a little bit of controversy itself. Jim, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the success of the book.
Thank you.
Did you expect this when you looked into ESPN, that it would have such worldwide appeal?
I guess the operative word was hope. You hope that people are going to respond. I think that ESPN elicits a lot of genuine interest from people who watch it, and actually, interestingly enough, a lot of people who don't watch it seem to be fascinated by what goes on there as well. So we're hoping for that. You
have really amazing access to the people who were there at the beginning, along the way, and even there today. How were you allowed such access?
It didn't start out that way. In fact, initially ESPN decided not to cooperate with the project, and so we were kind of banned from campus. I tried to interview people on campus, and they just decided not to cooperate for about a year. But then I will say, in fairness to them, once they decided that they wanted to do it, that they were willing to participate, it was great. We had access to everyone. What was the original hesitation? I think they're very protective of themselves. They don't like the idea of, an uncensored, unauthorized, biography, so to speak, of the company being done. And I think they were probably trying to talk us out of it. Well, I can see why, because having read the book, even though the title says those guys have all the fun, it wasn't all fun and games, and you reveal a lot of it. A lot of it is controversial. At the point that the book was being done, I guess it was, 30 years of its existence. And like many companies, it had its ups and downs. But I think that ESPN in particular had quite an extraordinary history. And so, the goal of the book was really to bring people who know the brand and know the network behind the scenes and let them know some of the things that went on that they may not have known before. Yeah, and it certainly does that. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things the book reveals. What was the most startling revelation for you in doing the research and the interviews when it came to ESPN and its history? Well, I think, part of it, I always view it, there's a business story, then there's a personal story, then there's behind the scenes stories. And for me, I guess it was the disparity between what people said publicly and felt publicly and maybe what they were thinking privately. When those of us who watched SportsCenter, let's say in the early 90s, and we were watching Keith Olbermann and Dan Patrick at 11 o'clock, you tuned on at 11 o'clock and it was a great show, and you really didn't know much else about that. And it turns out behind the scenes there's a lot going on. There's this whole idea of how does all of a sudden ESPN afford all these big contracts with all these leagues and everything. So you don't know what was going on behind the scenes to somehow generate that kind of money and stuff. So all those behind the scenes stuff was particular interest. Now, if you look at it from the business model, it was kind of a fluke that it turned out to be quite as successful as it is. Because originally people were, including cable operators, were saying, who's going to watch sports all the time? And now you can't get enough of sports. It's not only ESPN, it's everybody, including Comcast and NBC, which I should mention are our parent companies. Right. One of the initial founders talked about this, that people were saying to him, no one's going to watch sports 24/7. But there was a misapprehension, there was a misperception, I should say, which is that it's not about whether or not people are going to watch sports 24/7, it's that it's available 24/7. That distinction turns out to be huge, and guess what? People will be there. They'll watch at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'll watch it all different times, and I think that's been one of the hallmarks of their success. Was that Bill Rasmussen that you talked to that had that famous quote that it's not whether
people watch it, it's whether it's there and available?
It was actually one of the financing guys from Getty Oil, believe it or not. Getty Oil was, turns out they were a big sponsor of ESPN early on. He had gone to Tex Schramm, the president of the Dallas Cowboys, and said, you know, this guy Rasmussen wants to start this 24/7 network, and that Schramm was the guy who said, listen, nobody's going to watch sports 24/7.
We had Bill on when he wrote his book around the 30th anniversary and talked about his initial idea, he and his son, to come up with ESPN, and how he later was moved out of the project. And I bet that's one of those things that you just go, man, I wish I'd hung on a little tighter.
But here's the thing, I'm sure you recognize this, and I think, you know, I try and bring that up in the book. So Bill Rasmussen comes up with the idea for ESPN with his son, and he's basically there for only the first year.
Right.
And yet, I mean, I interviewed him 6 times. There's not one bitter bone in this guy's body. I mean, whatever kind of pharmacological help he's getting, whatever kind of food, I don't know, maybe he's on a gluten-free diet that helps. This guy is like the healthiest guy in the world when it comes to
no stress.
But there's no bitterness, there's no envy, there's no anything. And, you know, it's a company that's now worth over $40 billion.
It's unbelievable. I talked to him about that, and it's funny, I got that same impression from him, that I just didn't feel like, you know, he was bitter about it, and people recognize his part in formulating the idea, which became ESPN, and he's glad for what part he has. I want to know what you guys think, though. I mean, I could sit here and talk all day, but we want to give you the opportunity to join in. If you have questions about ESPN, or if you're surprised by any of the revelations made by the authors, you can go ahead and email us. And does what goes on behind the scenes really matter to sports fans? Do you really care what the work environment was like there, or whether there were opportunities for women, or sexual harassment, or any of that? Tell us what you think. You just want to watch sports? That's okay too. You can email me directly. I'm at lynn@lynndoyle.net. And as always, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. We will forward your comments to Jim, and I'm sure that he'll get back to you on all that. So you talk about the business model, and then you talk about the success of the personalities that we've come to know and love with ESPN. But like anything, a lot of egos in one building under one roof.
Yeah, the irony is that ESPN really didn't want to be a star system. In fact, the president of ESPN during the 90s, a guy named Steve Bornstein, said if it was up to him, he'd have robots delivering SportsCenter, because he didn't want to create stars. Yet at the same time, there was this powerful paradox at work, which is, I'm sure you might remember, and a lot of ESPN fans do, that in the mid-90s, they started doing the This is SportsCenter commercials, and they were featuring their own anchors. So at the same time that they're saying they don't want to create stars, they were putting all these guys, I mean, Charlie Steiner, Keith Olbermann, Dan Patrick was, you know, wonderful in these commercials. And they really created a cult for these people. So there were like 2 opposing forces going on. Yes, Keith with a mustache.
Well, it's funny because when you mentioned not wanting to make stars out of the anchors, that was the philosophy that Ted Turner had when he created CNN. You know, he just said, hey, anybody can sit down and read the news. We want everyone to be equal, and yet, as always, there's someone that rises to the top that people just seem to relate to a little bit more. Who was it there? Was it Keith? Did people love Keith, or did they hate Keith?
Well, first and foremost, it was Chris Berman.
Yes,
I think Chris Berman was there at the beginning, and I think to a certain degree Bob Lee, although Bob doesn't take up as much oxygen. He's actually kind of like the journalist of ESPN.
Look at Boomer. I love the story about Boomer and his voice.
Yes.
I love that in the book.
And Chris with a mustache too. Boy, the mustache thing they should pass a rule in Bristol. No mustaches. But I do think that, you know, Keith and Dan became the big men on campus. The show was incredibly successful. At the same time, I will say Bob Lee, Charlie Steiner, and Robin Roberts, who were doing the earlier version of SportsCenter, were incredibly successful as well. I mean, the 90s were a terrific time to be on the air at ESPN.
All right, well, we're not only going to talk more about the anchors that have done so well and the business model that has succeeded all around the world, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the revelations in the book about why the good old boys network existed the way that it did, why it was able to prevail for so long. In fact, some say well into the millennium. And we'll talk about the women of ESPN. Definitely want to hear about that. So stay with us. If you have questions or comments, email me at lynn@lynndoyle.net.